Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Very excited to have you all join this webinar and to host this webinar with our friends from Solarwinds. It's really awesome to have two brilliant speakers do this webinar today with us. We have Carrie Mellich from Nobl9, and we have Peter DiStefano from Solarwinds team. During this webinar, we will be talking about why SLOs are a must for SREs and cloud native services. I encourage everyone to stay to the very end because we're going to have a dedicated Q&A session where you have the chance to ask the speakers your SLO questions or questions about the webinar. So please hang out with us for a bit. And if you have any questions or concern, please use the chat function to reach out to us. And with that being said, I will hand over to Carrie.
Cool. Thanks, Erza. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here and making time for this. It's always fun to do these webinars with partners. But before we dive more deeply into why SLOs are so important, I just wanted to kind of start by briefly going over what SLOs are and just make sure everyone's on the same page. So there's three parts to what we call the reliability stack. That's going to be SLIs, SLOs, and error budgets. The first piece of that, the SLIs, that's really just a metric or a measurement that tells you how your service is operating. So it's usually a ratio of good to bad. It could also be like a threshold. And this is something that you're going to get from the tools you already have monitoring your services, like Pingdom, for example. A lot of people talk about the 4 golden signals here. That's these guys. I'll put a link in the chat after I'm done speaking here, or maybe towards the Q&A side. There's a lot of good information on this, so I'm going to kind of gloss over it. But I'll send some like follow-up, I guess, reading for you guys if you want to kind of go into this, and happy to answer any questions about this in the Q&A as well. So with an SLI, remember that's the measurement that tells us how our service is doing. We can build an SLO, and that's really just one or more targets or thresholds that we want those SLIs to meet. So all we're doing is giving ourselves a goal here. The best SLOs are goals that are going to help you determine a realistic minimum satisfaction level of your customer. So, you know, if there's a service that you hardly use, it probably doesn't need to be 100% reliable. In fact, we don't really need anything to be 100% reliable. Like, part of the benefit of running cloud native services is that most customers expect downtime. So if they're not using it 100% of the time, there's always going to be some wiggle room. And we should really never force ourselves to a goal of 100%. I think that's unrealistic, and it is one of the biggest causes of burnout. But anyway, I could talk about that for a long time, but let's move on. Next one we have is error budgets. And error budgets, those are really just an easier way to understand your performance of your SLO over a period of time. So without an error budget, we don't really get any new information from our SLOs, right? Like if an SLO is using a monitoring service we already have in place, all the SLO is saying is like, your SLO is doing fine right now, and right now, and right now, or it didn't do fine like last week. But the error budget basically quantifies that over a time window. So if you say like you want to be 99% reliable over the next 30 days, well, that's 1% that you could be unreliable, and 1% of a 30-day period, that math ends up at 7 hours, 18 minutes, and 17 seconds. So that's 7 hours, 18 minutes, and 17 seconds that your service can be having a bad time. And it's those realistic type of buffers that, you know, give us time to properly improve our services. So, you know, if your service is going down only 10 seconds every month, you can do one of two things. Like, you can either give yourself time to work on other projects or new features, or you could do like chaos practices, like what happens if everything shits the bed? Like what's the worst case scenario, and how do you recover from that? But you know, if your service is going down 10 hours every month, then that also gives you a clue of like, you should focus on the reliability and the infrastructure of what you currently have running. So yeah, that was a super brief, just like overview of the reliability stack. So who cares? Like, why SLOs? Why are people adopting this method, right? It's just using information we already have. I think for the longest time, there's been this disconnect between the business side and the dev side, and that's what brought this big push for DevOps, which was meant to unify those two. And SLOs are just another tool that help us do that. Particularly, I also think they help us manage our incident response, which is another big factor in burnout and fatigue in our industry. That's another topic I could talk about a lot. So we care though, right? Like, let's talk about some of the benefits. So we just talked about DevOps and how those two sides tend to be siloed without like that push for DevOps. SLOs give us a really easy to understand state of the product though, and that's going to help with communication across the entire company. Because let me tell you, everybody loves a good dashboard, and SLOs are great dashboards that tell you how the product is doing. So I think that's a really good unification of like all these different departments across the company. Another big one comes from incident response. We only want to alert when it matters. And what we're doing with SLOs is we're just mapping the customer journey with data. So while we're doing that, we're giving ourselves realistic standards from a customer's point of view. It's very easy to lose track of like what's actually affecting and impacting your customers. SLOs really like hone that back in, which I think makes it really much easier to like make sure that you're only doing things that matter for your like end product and your end users. So we don't really need to alert until it's really a problem in our customers' eyes. Pingdom actually has a really great use case for this that maybe Peter will talk about later, and that's the transactions feature. But moving on here, the other thing here, I mean, we're talking about alerting only when it matters. The other nice thing that we could do here is we can flag issues early because the information that we have from SLOs is predictive. They help flag early because we can alert on consumption of error budget. So that means if we're losing our error budget at a really rapid rate, like things are trending downward, and if it continues at the same trend, you know, we're going to eat up our error budget within like 5 hours. That's something really meaningful that we can alert on, that maybe we can resolve before the customer even notices it.
Hey, Carrie, can I just make
yeah.
a quick point here? I just, as you've been going through this, you know, a lot of us, and I'm sure a lot of folks who are on this webinar are talking a lot about observability and how important it is and how it's changing the industry. And that connection to what Carrie just talked about with SLOs being such an important part of that, even in that first bullet, understanding the state of the product. And, you know, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but that connection and focusing on what matters and then being proactive, right? This idea of, you know, getting an identification when you're running through that budget quickly before you get to the point where you run out of that budget. So, you know, all of this is so tightly woven in supporting this concept of observability. I just thought I'd just bring that up real quick.
No, that's a really good point. And it actually ties really well in with the last bullet here, which is prioritizing with dealing with tech debt. Because one of the biggest problems we have, I think, is there's often like too much to do, not enough people to do it, not enough time. And SLOs just help give better information about where you should focus, right? And that kind of prioritization, wow, words are hard. Prioritization, you know, like if we're eating up our error budget every month, like it's a pretty clear sign that you should work on tech debt, and knowing how it affects the end user, I think, is the most important part about where you can prioritize that properly. Because it's always really hard. Like that's a problem with our team now, even like we're pretty small. So it's, you know, there's always going to be too much to do. And it's hard to make a case about like what you should work on first, unless you have data like this. So yeah, that's just a really quick overview. Again, happy to answer questions in the chat and the Q&A at the end. But before I hand it over to Peter, I did want to give a very recent real example of how SLOs have been a benefit to my work. So I'm actually on call right now, and I was on call this past weekend as well. And we noticed there was a bunch of alerts coming in from one of our endpoints. So I took a look at our SLOs. That's what this was a screenshot after the fact. But I noticed, the search grid availability API was really low. Our error budget was burning up. And we were trying to figure out why it was gone. So I hopped on, checked out if I could find any correlations or why it would be so low. And the thing is, here we had two SLOs set. We had one that was rated as perfect, which was like our ideal situation. And we had one that was basically our minimum, which we called alarming. And I do want to point out, we could have also done this with a threshold, but this was a pretty new SLO. So I kind of like having two separate charts sometimes when you're first starting. It helps kind of give you a better idea of how urgent this actually is when you're still trying to figure out what your average or what your good ratio should be. But yeah, anyway, so in this case, the alarming rate was totally fine, but the perfect one wasn't. And the thing was, that was totally okay. I realized I didn't need to spend my whole weekend trying to look into this and recovering this error budget, because our minimum satisfaction was still being met. And that's from the alarming one. You can see that the error budget there is still doing really well. And that meant that this issue could wait for normal working hours on Monday. And by that time, it turned out that it was a known issue that we were already actively working on. So I think it was the right decision, not to waste all of this time digging into this, or worse, I've seen this happen a lot, is maybe while I'm trying to resolve this issue, maybe I end up restarting a service, and then that caused some other issue to happen. And it can cascade into like a lot of different problems, and then you really get sucked in. So this was really nice, because this gave me my weekend back basically, and I was able to spend my time unclogging my 3D printer instead of trying to dig into this SLO, where my air budget was gone, and it was something that we already expected that I just maybe hadn't known about yet, because it was part of a sprint that hadn't finished. So yeah. Anyway, I want to hand it over to Pete now. He's gonna, I think, really be able to tie this all up with a bow, and I know he's got some really interesting points to talk about too.
Thank you, Carrie. For those of you who can see my picture, I'm thinking of Carrie talking about her clogs on her 3-dimensional printer. I remember a 80-column Epson impact printer that I used to use. Anyway, but that was like 100 years ago. If you guys ever want to, you can go to the Smithsonian Institute. I'm sure there'll be one on display. This whole idea about like SLOs are needed now more than ever. And I know I'm preaching to the choir to most of the folks on this call. And, whether you are whether you're an SRE, cloud engineer, but you're in a DevOps team, or just an application developer, and you've been doing it for a long time, or part of your company is now starting to embrace a DevOps philosophy, you're dealing with this perfect storm. And it's all good, except for the people like Carrie and the folks on the call that have to kind of keep this whole thing running and keep everyone happy, because you've got obviously this influx in newer technology, and a whole lot of reasons why people will leverage cloud native technologies, as well as a DevOps philosophy for developing applications and services, is because of the capability there to innovate and innovate quickly. So whether it gives a company an opportunity to leverage IT, not as a cost center, like when I was growing up, right? It was this big, expensive, required thing that just sucked the life out of the bottom line of a company, to where now IT is really a critical part of a company's strategy. So knowing that there's these opportunities either to be more competitive, take a lead, or even just survive, is taking this approach. So you've got this demand that is becoming exponential. You've got all of these new technologies, and now we're talking about microservices architecture running across multiple containers, across multiple cloud environments, and even some of it could be in a traditional data center. You got all these moving pieces, you got all this new technology, and the demand is off the charts. So as Carrie and I were actually talking, and she was just mentioning a few minutes ago, there's not enough time to do the job. Doesn't matter what it is, or even, how many people you bring in, although most companies are pretty tight on how many resources you bring in. So you got these demands to deploy more at a higher level of quality in less time. And there's like, and I know Kerry was saying 100% availability is just a fool's errand, but that's what our customers want, right? That's what the customer, oh yeah, like I have no patience for downtime, no patience for slow applications, which is the new downtime. And slows become so essential, but they also need to be something that can take a lot of time to get them. They've got to be leverageable, they've got to be usable, and they've got to be simple to get up and running. And the reason that's important, I'm sorry, you were going to say something?
I want to make a quick point to what you said there about like no
Sure.
time or patience for slow or down applications, but I actually think that is a misconception that comes from the business side. You know, when somebody like a business owner has a software that they own, right? Like they run the company that makes the software. They want their product, it's their baby. They want it to be perfect and always up. But I don't think that's necessarily the case from the customer's point of view. Like I was mentioning before, like most things people aren't going to be using 100% of the time, and maybe it's a more urgent one, and there's definitely some like special scenarios like banking where we don't expect any downtime. But I think outside of that, people don't understand computers enough, or maybe they do understand computers enough to be like, this is down, this is a computer problem, computers are a bad idea. So I'd like to just challenge what you said there about the customer's expectation of that. I do think that comes from the business expectation, and the customers are actually a lot more forgiving about it.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And you're absolutely correct. And when I talked about the customer in the context, I'm thinking of the people that you are building and supporting the applications for, which is the business. But you're right, the end customer, the user.
Yeah.
So we're absolutely on the same page. And of course, there's the perception versus the reality too. So well said. But as you know, though, it's a complex world we're in right now, right? And I think Kerry also mentioned this. The more time you can spend deploying, and helping the company innovate, that has an impact on the business, and less time either trying to figure out where you are, how things are running, and then of course spending less time having to remediate, especially if you're in a down environment, the better off you're going to be. You can go to the next slide. So if you buy off on the idea that these service level objectives are important, the one thing I've learned since we've been working with Nobl9 is it is pretty amazing how fast and how easy it is to get a SLO up and running. And a little bit self-serving here, but when you talk about leveraging the information from, say, Pingdom, and how quick and easy it is to get up and running, and then leverage that information, whether it be the uptime or the transaction tests, to build your SLOs together, it's really a powerful story. And I was trying to have a little bit of fun using that Home Depot saying that, if you guys have ever heard that commercial, it's more savings, more doing. And I know it's a little cornball, but I thought that really makes sense, right? Because the quicker, and again, it's not just about doing things quickly. Quickly is overrated if it's not accurate, right? If it's not actually doing what you need it to do. So the idea of this combination, and we're going to show you in a moment, of leveraging Pingdom and its information into building your SLOs, you're going to spend less time there and more time, hopefully, innovating and having that capability to, again, and actually, quite frankly, do the more enjoyable parts of the jobs. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just switch over. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, assuming you guys can, hopefully you can see my screen. I'm going to go and make it. So if you were out there and you went to pingdom.com and you clicked on the start a trial button, you'll give us a little bit of information and you'll get this screen. So I just saved another 30 seconds there. Okay. So I want to show you first how you set up an uptime test or an endpoint test in Pingdom. So literally, I put my name's already in there because I filled out a trial form. Okay. And I'm going to one thing Pingdom does really cool is, as part of the setup, it's going to automatically send an alert to me just to test that the function's working. Okay. In this case, I'm just going to put www.nobl9.com. So I could put the homepage of my web application. I could put a specific page, and maybe a critical page or pages on my website. Let me just put in Texas here. Okay, so I mean, literally, I signed up for the trial. I put in a URL, and I'm done. Okay, what it's doing right now, it's going into Pingdom. It's created an uptime check. If I'm going to go over here to synthetics and uptime, and bear with me here, you'll see here it already created the uptime check. Okay, now I'm gonna drill into this a little bit. And again, it's just starting to collect the data now, and I can collect the data for uptime. I can check it every 60 seconds, every 5 minutes. I'm just going to go in here real quick and show you how it defaulted the setup, but I can change the regions that it's doing the test from. So if I care about, testing this from Europe, from Asia, I think we have over 130 probes around the world. But as you can see here, I can do some additional things. I can put some tags in there. I can even put some information, kind of like a run book. If I get this error, okay, and I've got this kind of an issue, it'll give them guidance or a link to a run book on how to solve the problem. And then integration-wise, as I mentioned, it sent me an alert. I'm looking on my phone right now, and it sent me an alert from Pingdom saying, "Hey, Peter, we just wanted to let you know that the alerting is working just fine." But I could use SMS, and I can send it to all sorts of, PagerDuty and Slack and all different notification options. So this is uptime, right? So again, this is not that interesting because it was just built just now. So, in the next 5 minutes, 6 minutes, then you'll start to see a graph. I'll show you some of that later. But that's how simple that was. The other thing Pingdom does with Nobl9 is creating a transaction. Okay, so a transaction basically is simulating going through the steps of critical elements of a service or an application. I'm going to give you an example here of how easy it is to create a transaction test. So in Pingdom, we have this thing called a recorder. So I'm going to go right here. I'm going to type in www.nobl9.com, and I'm going to hit record. You'll notice to the right, you'll see the URL, go to http://nobl9.com. Okay, I'm going to be a little self-serving again. I'm saying, okay, I want to make sure that the path to understanding how Pingdom integrates with Nobl9 is working on this website. So I'm going to click here on integrations, and you'll notice to the right, as I click, that list will build. I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to scroll. I'm going to click on Pingdom. And again, you'll see the list on the right continues to build. And then I'm going to say, oh, I want to get the tips and tricks. And then you can see here, it's going to add that. I can do this with a very simple transaction or very complex transaction. When I'm done, I just stop recording right here. I'm going to stop the recording. I save it and send it to Pingdom. And now it becomes a test that I can go back into Pingdom, and I can decide how often do I want to run that test. So it's real simple. Anyone can go in and create a transaction. So now what I want to do is I'm going to switch over here to Nobl9. And hold on a second. I'm sorry, I couldn't find the screen. Okay, so what you have here, now these are some, I'm going to create a SLO, but to show you, we created one here. This was a website test. Okay, and we created two objectives. And as Kerry was mentioned earlier, this is an example using Pingdom where we had one that says, okay, as long as it was less than 1200 milliseconds, that was good. If it was less than 1500 milliseconds, so it could go a little longer, it's still okay, but more average. So you can create multiple objectives. And of course, you've got the capability in Nobl9 creating SLOs to do composite service level objectives. So really cool stuff. And just to show you this other example, here's one of, this was a transaction test. Okay, and I can click into it. Again, this is using Pingdom. And again, testing the process. If you see here on the right, it says VMan. Virtualization Monitor is a product we have at Solarwinds. And I went in and created the test that started from going to solarwinds.com, going through the trial process, filling out a form. And of course, that's an important thing to test to make sure it works, because that's somebody signing up for a trial. So as you can see, whether it's the availability of a key web application or service that you have, or you want to test transactions, you know, of an online business, or you've got a way that people sign up for your service, and you want to make sure that form can correctly be filled out and successfully being filled out. So any critical transaction you have, you can very easily create that. So that's on the Pingdom side. All right, so what do you do first if you want to create a SLO? Well, you've got the capability to create a project. I'm not going to create a project here. I've got one called default, but this is a way for you to organize all your service level objectives. And you can organize them really based on what's important to you. It could be based on different departments and those applications. It could be based on a specific application. It could be based on, there might be a set of objectives based on a specific part of a service. So it's totally up to you. It just makes it easier for you to organize your service level objectives. Here, I created multiple services. So in this case, it's right here. I'm not going to recreate this. I'll click into it because there's not much to do, right? What I do is I've got my service. Oh, sorry about that. I meant to click on this. And basically, I start with the service. Okay, I named it website availability. What's the data source I'm using? And I'm going to show you that in a minute. Actually, why don't I go to that now? Let me get out of this. Oops, sorry. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Let's just get to the point. So I'm going to create a service level objective. Now, again, what I would have done first, and I'll talk it through, is I created a service and I made sure I had an integration. And matter of fact, let me click on integrations real quick. Sorry. As you can see here, Nobl9's got a bunch of different existing monitoring tools that you can quickly create service level objectives from. And I'm just clicking on these. I'm not going to create it, but here I just add the token, and I take that from Pingdom. I literally go into the settings in Pingdom, I create a token, I paste it in here, and then what project I'm using. Like I said, I was using default, and I give it a name. Okay, so, and as you can see here, I've created two sources. One is for the availability, just testing, and the other one's for the transaction test. So again, I'm going to go back to the service level objectives. So what do? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a service level objective. Okay, the service I'm going to use the website availability because I'm just doing a web test. Okay, the data source, again, I've already created it. I'm going to use this, that's Nobl Pingdom. You saw how easy it was to just click on that source earlier. The check ID. Okay, this is really easy to do. I can go over here. Let me do this. I'm going to go back into Pingdom just so you get an idea to the synthetics. I'm going to go to the uptime check I just created. And when I click on it, you'll see here, if you can see at the top of the screen, you see it says check equals. So I'm just going to copy that number. Okay, that's considered the check ID. So that's associating this uptime check. So now when I go back over to Nobl9, I just paste in that check ID. That's all I had to do. Okay, this is an uptime check, so my status is up. Okay, my time window, a lot of times I think most folks will use this 28-day rolling window, but I can change that. For example, I'm going to say over the next 6 hours. So I can, have a shorter period, longer period, then defining the target, right? So here I'm going to say my target's 95%. And then again, if you remember the one I showed you, if it's less than 1200 milliseconds, and it really just depends on your situation, what you want to do. I'm just going to call this available good, the check ID, up status. Okay, sorry, let me just bring my screen up. Sorry. Okay, and at that point, I give it a name. Let's see, Nobl9, uptime, sorry, SLO. This is where I could create a composite SLO, so it could look at a combined things, and it would look at a variety of budgets, but not needing to do that. And then I can look at a slow burn. I'm gonna use fast burn, right? Because if it's burning fast, bigger concern, but I might want to create a couple of those, or maybe I want to look at both of them. Okay, and then at that point,
Just want to call out here, if you scroll back up, your display name is in the yeah, the other name there is the Kubernetes name.
yeah, sorry about that. I missed that.
But generally, if you type in display name, it'll automatically generate the name below if there's no values in there already.
Yeah, my bad. I missed that. It automatically creates it correctly with the correct syntax by me doing it this way. Thank you. Sorry. So you see here, it automatically populated and put a dash there, so it's accurately represented from a syntax perspective. Okay, so now, and that's all it takes to create the SLO. And you can see here now, it's going to start working. So again, you'll see here, this will show up here. It's just starting now, but it's that quick, right? So, when I was working with the team, I said, okay, let me go play around. I created a variety of transaction tests, and I created some availability tests. Here again, we have a couple of objectives here. It was that quick. I mean, it took us, I don't know how many, not but 5 minutes or so, and even with me fumbling around here. So fairly quick process. And now, not only do I have the uptime information, and I've got those alerts, but like I said, it's not just the thresholds, it's okay, looking at how quickly am I burning through? And that's why, here's this example where I've burned through this, right, on this transaction test, this vman trial sign up. And then here I'm looking at a different sign up transaction I created for AppOptics, which is another one of our SaaS products. So it's not just about having the thresholds, but how am I doing, not just at this point in time. I think Kerry mentioned it, I can know right now versus, well, how quickly am I burning through this? And when am I approaching that point where I probably need to do something?
Yeah, I also want to mention at this point too, SLOs are really meant to be iterated over a course of time, right? Or continuously, always, forever. Your SLOs are going to change based off of what your customers need. And as your product changes, your customers' need may change. And even just over the course of time, even for some reason your product never changes, your customers' needs of it are going to change. So your SLOs should be continuously growing and changing as you do these measurements, because over time, the more data you get, the better you're going to be able to kind of adjust to what you believe your customer needs.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. With most things, especially this, this set it and forget it, it doesn't make sense, because as you over time you learn more, and then you can be, you can kind of dial in, if you will, better each time. I gave the example of Pingdom today, and Kerry also talked earlier about how important the end user perspective is. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to the slides. I want to talk a little bit about the impact that the end user has on this whole concept of observability and why it's so important. Again, earlier on when Kerry was talking, she talked about understanding the state of the product. And I'm sure you've all been inundated with all sorts of observability messages from all sorts of vendors, as well as some academic definitions. Matter of fact, observability is the ability to infer a system's internal state and its impact on users, right? What does that mean, infer a system's internal states? It's no longer good enough to say, again, me being gray-haired, think of typical traditional network operating center, or NOC, right? And you got all sorts of screens on the wall and got green everywhere and everything is looking great. Irrelevant. It's irrelevant if the user is not feeling that. And it's irrelevant to just look at all these things in silos. You need to look at them collectively, and that's how you understand the state. And you talk about a system, you talk about a business service, and you talk about the things, as Kerry was mentioning earlier, are you impacting the end customer? And that's where observability is trying to raise above just that siloed approach to IT. And then when you look at the way DevOps is now building out applications, because it's so close and so interwoven with a business strategy. I mean, whether you're I don't know, Uber or Spotify, and your whole IT world started in the cloud with cloud native custom applications, or you're at a large company or a mid-sized company that's kind of got a foot in both camps, it's becoming more and more important to understand that end expectation of the user, which is really how it gets more closely tied to the business. Now, in that very traditional description of observability, you hear things like, well, you need to have the metrics and traces, like time series metrics, like those golden signals that Kerry was talking about, traces, distributed transaction traces, and logs. You need all three of those things. You can go to the next slide. And I would not disagree with that. That's your traditional APM. However, that's the server side. When you think of it as a developer or an SRE, the server side is that's the time series metrics and traces and logs. That's the server side. But as we just talked about, the client side is really important. And you can think everything's fine, but if the user's not fine, then you have an issue. So having the user's perspective, and that's what we just showed with Pingdom, so starting a SLO with the user's perspective of how a service is running is a really good way to go for two reasons. Number one, it really gives you a sense of, do I really have an issue, and how do I, so I can prioritize what I work on. But the second thing is it's really easy to get going and add a lot of value. A lot of our Pingdom customers, they absolutely are using that information, that user experience information, to build out their service reporting, if you will, so they can show how they're delivering on that service. So I'm suggesting to you that the combination of both the client side, which is the user experience, which is really what Pingdom does, and the server side together is really where you're going to achieve maximum observability. Why don't you go one more slide? So before we go into the Q&A, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time and listening to us right now, I do want to talk a little bit about achieving or ensuring those SLOs. So this is going to be a little bit of an advertisement, if you will, for APM. But whether it's SolarWinds or not, being able to understand how you're burning budget, and if you are on a rapid pace to burning out your budget, what do you do now that you've identified, okay, there's an area here, I'm using this same set of monitoring tools, whether it's SolarWinds or one of the other vendors, to help understand how my SLO is doing. Then how do I go back in and use those same tools to ensure that before that budget runs out, if there's an issue, I can rectify it? And with SolarWinds, we've had these independent products, SolarWinds App Optics, that's your time series metrics and traces. SolarWinds Logly, which is your log. It's not just log aggregation and search, it's also analytics. And then SolarWinds Pingdom, which that's the client side. We've brought those together in what we're calling the APM integrated experience. And I know that screenshot's kind of hard to see, right? But what you can't hardly see on the left is all three of those metrics, traces, logs, and end user experience are all built into this an experience on the left. So what you see on the screen is a Pingdom function, but you can work and there's correlation between those logs and the traces and the metrics. But to ensure SLOs, it's important that you have an APM that can help you quickly identify from the user experience all the way down to potentially a poor performing line of code. And that's why I think this partnership with how APMs, like what I'm sharing here, along with Nobl9, really together can really help you take that next step beyond the more traditional monitoring and analysis, and really start looking at having systems and really being able to observe the true state, and then when and how to prioritize when there are issues. Anyway, that's what we wanted to share today. What we did want to do is open it up for any questions. And I think, Carrie, you might have some to share with us.
Oh, yes, sorry, I wasn't muted. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really awesome. And I personally love how easy Pingdom is. Like, I think Pingdom is one of the best like monitoring services that really focus on the customer. A lot of this, is very service specific. There's PROM, there's all these like error rates and stuff that we can measure, but it doesn't really mean much to us unless we can connect it to the customer. I think Pingdom does a good job of that. But yeah, let's see. I've got some questions here. Looks like Curtis put in the Q&A. Is there more to it? I'm assuming he's or they're referring to Pingdom here. So is it more than just hitting a website? Are there synthetic tests like Catalan or Datadogs?
Yeah, so so I just showed you a very simple HTTP or an HTTPS uptime check. We can look at APIs and DNSs and POP3s, and there's a lot we can do with uptime, but Pingdom also has a synthetic. I showed you the example of the transactions. You can create multiple transaction tests. Pingdom also does page speed. Okay, so it'll evaluate, literally you pick the key web pages and it'll actually show you a film strip, and it'll show you as it's loading the page, is it the JavaScript? Is it an image that wasn't compressed? It'll show you as it loads a page, how much time is that taking in each element and how much time it takes. And it'll actually show you visually as that page is building what it looks like. That's all synthetics. Pingdom also has a whole real user monitoring, or RUM. So you can literally not only have the synthetics or simulate the user experience, it has a real user monitoring capability where you can actually see what that user's actual experience is, whether it be where the region they're in, if they're on a desktop or a tablet, which browser they're using. You can understand the performance, their experience. There's also a user satisfaction index that's built into it. So yeah, it's a whole lot more than just a couple of website uptime checks. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. And I also wanted to put out here one that was, I had talked in the chat, but just so that we have it out on the recording, or if anyone's not looking at the chat, but I had put in the original golden signals from Google SRE book. I put a link in there so people can look into that more. And I also mentioned one that I like to include in that, which is called Correctness. So for me, that's like the 5th golden signal. And somebody asked, like, what does correctness mean in this sense? And I just want to say that to me, is this service actually getting the results I'm expecting? Because like we talked about before, all of these measurements are great, but if you can't link it back to what the customer actually sees, it's pretty meaningless. So to me, like, correctness is saying, like, everything could be going really well in my service or my app or whatever I'm measuring, it can be doing great, but if it's not returning the right like result or the right end product there to what the customer is seeing, like, that's really meaningless. So that's another one that I like to add in. I usually like save that one as like a I guess like V2 of my SLOs. It's like get the basics in there first, and then focus on like, okay, this is all doing well. Now, am I doing it right? So I just wanted to add that in there in case anybody missed that. Let's see, I got another question for you in a DM here. How many locations can Pingdom test a website or transaction?
So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a bunch of probes all over the world. We today break it down into like 5 or 6 regions, yet we're expanding that. A lot of people ask, well, can I want to test from Italy? Well, we can test from Europe, right? So we can test from multiple, from a couple of locations. Matter of fact, you can go into Pingdom and you can see where the probes are, so you can see where they are. But we don't give you the flexibility today to pick any one of those probes. It's by regions. And I think one thing I forgot to mention as well is what's really cool, because Kerry makes a good point. I've talked a lot about time is a problem and speed is important, but unless you're accurate, it doesn't matter. You can get to the root cause of a problem quickly, and if it's not the actual root cause, you're starting from scratch. Well, one of the kind of cool things about Pingdom, you talk about all these probes. Well, what'll happen is if you have an alert condition that arises, okay, from a probe, it'll test another probe from that region to see if it still gets the alert condition. And only if both of those probes agree that, yes, this is an alert condition, does it fire off the alert and then do the communication. But yeah, there are multiple regions that, like when you saw when I was setting up the check, it gives you about 5 or 6 choices. And we're looking at, do we take that one more step down?
Awesome. Cool. And I want to just mention too, I know the name of the webinar is like why it's so important for cloud native services, but I want to just mention too, like, it doesn't really matter if it's cloud or on-prem or however you run your product. Like, it's just about how your monitoring data is being useful to you. So it really depends on what you use to monitor your data, and SLOs are very agnostic to that. It doesn't matter what you use. You're going to be able to make that data transform into something that is going to be able to connect back to your customer, and that's, I think, the best benefit there. So while we did talk a little bit, I think we've touched on it a little bit, I just want to make clear that this is, like, I think useful for everybody. And in my experience, like, one of the things that I've seen a lot is just that, like, SLOs is just another thing that we have to set up and own and monitor and stuff. And oftentimes that gets kind of daunting, especially if you're on like a really small team, like my team too, where it's like, we have so much to do. Like, this is just another thing to add onto our plate, building SLOs. But I do really find a lot of value in them. And if you can set aside, make time, even if it's just like a week, to get started with some like really basic stuff. And that's kind of why I like the Pingdom stuff, because it's so easy to set up. Like, that one really takes 5 minutes. There's not really any instrumentation that you need to get some of the basic information out there. But the more that you can like find time to just set that up, I think the better you're going to be in the long run. It's one of those things that's like, spend the time now and see the payout later. But I do think that payout is huge. And we've shown like Nobl9 in this as well. And we put some links there in the chat for like trials for both Pingdom and Nobl9. But I also want to be clear, like, Nobl9 isn't the only solution. I think it's to me, what I've seen, and even from things that have been built like internally, Nobl9 is like a very wholesome solution, and I really think it's one of the best ones out there. But if you need something quick or like free, Nobl9 also helped push out OpenSLO, which is an open source version of SLOs. And you can import those SLOs into Nobl9 eventually if you get to a point where you want to do that. But anything you can do to just like get started, I think that's really important. And I do want to add that, SLOs really are most valuable when you are the most stressed. So yeah. Yeah, let's see. Anybody else have any questions in here? Or Peter, do you have anything that you want to add? Just like thoughts?
No, I do. I liked everything you said, and I think it'd be hard pressed anyone on the call that's not got some level of stress, knowing what we're all dealing with in tech. And the point that Kerry made about you really need to leverage SLOs as part of your daily operating procedure. It's really going to be helpful, however you do it. And I know I did some selfish promotion of the SolarWinds APM, but even still, and I'm sure you guys are already using something out there. But these used to be nice to have things that I believe are now absolutely required if you're going to deliver a level of service that's required today. So however you get them, and getting started, like, don't boil the ocean, right? So everything Kerry said was absolutely spot on.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. Well, we've got about 5 more minutes, I think, or six minutes. If anyone has anything they'd like to add, questions, comments, or concerns, or anything that they'd like to ask us. I'm also in a lot of different Slack communities. You can find me in like Hug Ops, and there's a SLOconf monthly one that we have as well. That's a really cool like SRE get together. If anybody, I don't always make it to the meetings, but I like to just be in the Slack as well, because there's some activity there. It's pretty nice to be able to, commiserate with somebody that you've just had a terrible incident and talk to somebody who's knows the experience. But yeah, I really think SLOs are great for incident management in general. And I can tell you, like, me being on call literally right now, I feel comfortable, doing this webinar while I'm on call, even though potentially something can happen any minute. But, I think we are set up for success in that we've really set up our SLOs to focus on the customer. And at this point, it's like, I know that I'm not going to be called into something unless there's a real issue that's affecting a customer or it's about to. And that
Kerry, I'll tell you,
a lot better.
Yeah, I can tell you, I'm for one very happy that you're not going to get called away, or you didn't get called away in the middle of this webinar. And
that would have been funny.
We talked a lot about time, right? And Kerry mentioned the trials. I mean, I know you guys don't have a lot of time, but man, take a half an hour, get the trials. Pingdom's 30 days. I think what Nobl is a 14 days.
Yeah, but if you just contact us, we're pretty open about it,
Yeah,
I think
but
it
honestly,
starts 14 days by default.
Yeah. The 14 days or plus is really to just watch it start collecting, right? I mean, getting a sense of what it is, it'll take you no time at all, during a coffee break, or I guess for us it'd be like a monster break or something like that. But yeah, it's something that if you're not already thinking about it, and you really are trying to be kind of taking the lead with your implementations and delivering the best you can, this is definitely something, again, I believe is a requirement for DevOps shops, cloud native. Like I said, it does apply whether you're more traditional on-prem, but absolutely, I think it becomes a requirement today with the demands that are being placed on all of you and what you're being asked to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We got another question here from the chat. Does Nobl9 integrate with Azure App Insights? So at the moment, no. We though do a very like white glove service when you even start a trial, where we try to work with you to figure out how we can integrate things that you already have, or just, you know, work with what you've got. So definitely we would be able to help you find workarounds for that. I will tell you, it's absolutely on our roadmap to eventually integrate with them. We have a huge long list of integrations that we're adding constantly. But if you go to this website, docs.nobl9.com, if you just use the little caret for sources, you could see what we currently integrate with. And like I said, there's just a lot of different ways you can get around that too. And for free, I mean, like open source ways that you can kind of like link from one thing to another without adding extra costs or too much maintenance on your side. So not directly, but eventually. Cool. Well, I think it's just about time to wrap up, unless anyone has any last minute questions they want to add, they can put in the chat or in the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time, Peter, and doing that demo. That was awesome. I love, you know, like we talked about this earlier, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I love when people do demo that aren't from that company, you know, because it's like, it doesn't really tell me personally how good or easy it is to use unless somebody else is doing it and without a lot of experience. And I think it's pretty awesome that seeing that like integration of how quick between going from Pingdom to Nobl9 was pretty cool to see. You know, I personally don't even get in there as often as I should, but I love being able to get that data so quickly. Is just so useful.
Thank you for inviting me and letting me share a little bit with you today. This was really enjoyable, and I hope there was value we provided to the folks that attended.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. And we did record this, so if you didn't get a chance to see the whole thing, or you want to send this to somebody, we'll be able to send this link out to everybody as well. And I think it's going to go on YouTube.
Correct. Thank you, team. Amazing job, Peter and Carrie.